Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is B.D. McClay. Could you introduce yourself, B.D.?
Yeah, I'm the associate editor at the Hedgehog Review, which is a journal of ideas associated with the University of Virginia. We come out 3 times a year. And more relevant to the subject of this, I am a Charlottesville resident, and was at both of the rallies that have taken place over the past couple of months. The Ku Klux Klan rally on July 8th, and then the Unite the Right rally on August 12th, and recently published an article about it.
Yeah, so thanks for coming on. So I asked you on because you wrote this really interesting essay that we'll link to called Monumental Woes. So you were at this rally that everyone knows about by now. Could you just kind of describe what it was like to be there?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like in terms of sort of being in a crowd that is very active, but also very clumped, almost like being at a parade, from the area where I was anyway. There were lots of, on the counter-protesting side, there were lots of clergy, very strong, visible religious presence, and also, of course, Antifa and so on. But the Unite the Right people were behind a barrier by the time I got there.
Mm-hmm.
So I mostly saw them when they were doing maneuvers to get in and out of the barrier. They would kind of coordinate them with their shields. A lot of them had these honestly fairly dorky looking wooden shields, or sometimes sort of repurposed riot shields.
Mm-hmm.
Although the problem is it's very hard not to laugh at these people because they do look very silly, with wooden shields and tiki torches and whatever, but then they're actually quite serious. The other group that was active and present there were the militia members from the 3%ers and so on, who came extremely heavily armed and sort of presented themselves as the people there to make sure nothing got ugly.
Right.
And I chatted with one of them a little bit, and he was just like, "We just want to make sure that everything's peaceful and everyone gets to talk."
Yeah, and they're dressed in, people have probably seen the videos, but they're dressed as if they are like National Guard troops that are deployed and wearing tactical armor and holding submachine guns.
Yeah. They were, it was sort of like the Unite the Right people had shown up with their own little army. That was kind of how it looked.
Mm-hmm.
And the governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, actually later said that the police didn't interfere because they were afraid of the militia, which the police have denied, but wasn't super comforting to read.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of the scene, and there were definitely patches of it that were rougher than other patches. When I showed up, I saw somebody getting treated for having been sprayed with pepper spray, and I saw, I think the most aggressive thing I actually saw somebody do was I saw a woman chuck a water bottle over the barrier into the rally. But we've all seen videos of fist fights and more serious stuff, so that also did happen. I just didn't see it.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like the main part of the rally never actually happened. Is that right?
Yeah. So I showed up a little bit late into the proceedings. I showed up, I think, a little before 11, but nothing was actually supposed to start until 12. That was why I sort of woke up and found out that everything was still happening, already happening. And basically, before the rally could even start, the police just declared it an unlawful assembly and ordered everyone to disperse. And then it became a kind of weird game of where are they going? Because they sort of started drifting up the street, and they'd all kind of clump together waiting for somebody else. So for a while, there were just these sort of disparate groups of neo-Nazis and white supremacists wandering around Charlottesville. And it wasn't clear if they were going to try and hold their rally somewhere else, or and then everything seemed over. And I went home, and during that period where things seemed over, that was when James Alex Field crashed that car into some protesters marching through Charlottesville's pedestrian mall. So, I mean, that was really, I mean, it would have been shocking anyway, but it also sort of came after everything seemed done. But yeah, no, I don't think that they actually got to hold anything really, other than their Tiki Torch March.
Right. So the Tiki Torch procession happened the night before, and do they have a permit for that, or was that just kind of a surprise thing? That's why there weren't cops around to police the area.
All I really know is that I'm an employee of UVA, and so we got a very strange email from Teresa Sullivan, the president, saying something like, we found out that some Unite the Right protesters were planning to march across the UVA, and we asked them the route that they were planning to take, and they gave us one, but that's not the route that they took. It was a very odd, we asked the neo-Nazis how they were planning to march so we could put police there, and they lied to us. That's kind of the gist of it. So I don't think that was I don't think that they had a permit, but I'm not positive.
And what was the crowd like among the counter protesters? You mentioned that there were a lot of clergy, and the people who have gotten attention and were characterized by the president as, kind of morally equivalent to the Nazis are the Antifa people who came there to brawl. But what was kind of like the crowd like more generally?
I mean, it was really a mix of people. You had people like me who were just kind of observing, and there were quite a few older people too. Actually, I had a very charming conversation with an older woman wearing a Methodist pen, who's probably in her late 60s, and she was explaining to me how to prepare better next time in case I got tear gassed. And later I was talking to two older women who were Quakers, and they gave me a flyer about what to do if I got arrested. So older, but very veterans. And the Democratic Socialists of America were there. They, with their flag, and Charlottesville's like Black Lives Matter and so on. I would say the main activity I saw was just chanting. Not really. I mean, for one thing, again, by the time I showed up, the Unite the Right was fairly well sequestered behind the barriers, and so there wasn't much opportunity for people to brawl, even if that was what they were there for, except when they were coming in and out of the space. I thought about going into the rally side, but didn't really feel like going there by myself. So, but yeah, I mean, racially fairly diverse, probably slightly more white people, but not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah, and I mean, in terms of people who are kind of like, I don't know, sort of like the black bandana and stuff, there really weren't that many people like that there.
Mm-hmm.
I did see a few, but it wasn't like I sort of skipped in and realized that I'd brought, a pen to a knife fight or something.
Uh-huh.
But
So the ostensible reason for the Unite the Right rally was about this statue. It's Jackson, right? It's not Lee.
it's Lee. There are two statues.
Okay.
And one is Jackson and one is Lee. And the KKK came to protest the removal of the Jackson statue. Unite the Right was here for Lee. Yeah, I think basically the city of Charlottesville voted earlier this year to remove both statues. It's not quite clear what will happen to them. Initially, they were going to be moved to a different park, and then now they might be sold to a museum or something. I don't think destroying them is actually on the table, but and this one man who lives in Charlottesville, whose name is Jason Kessler, was quite angry about this. And as it's been debated in Charlottesville, there's kind of a active upset part of the population that apparently shows up at city council meetings with machetes.
Okay.
Called flaggers.
Uh-huh.
And they are they oppose removing the statue. But again, the city council voted to do it, and then but there still are quite a few legal issues because the statue of Lee might be too old, might be like too historic to move. So there's a lawsuit involving that going on right now too. But anyway, yeah, Unite the Right was there to protest the removal of the Lee statue and to, I guess, raise consciousness for white rights. I don't really know. I mean, I think I read the League of the South's press release, and it was kind of like, this is about showing that white people get to organize around their interests too, but no actual interests were put forth.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's
aside from the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
it's one of the things that's interesting about this whole disaster is how much of it is just being battled out on purely symbolic lines. So a statue is a representation of someone who is being honored, and the first, and so there's, the rally was around a statue that some people want to remove, some people want to keep, and then one of the first reactions to the violence was a group of people pulled down a Confederate war statue in Durham, North Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure people have seen the video. So, the initial fight is over a symbol. There was concrete harm of people being murdered and mauled, and then the debate seems to have moved back to the symbolic level, where now we're talking about should Confederate monuments be removed.
Right.
So why don't we talk about your piece in particular right now?
Yeah. I did want to say, I mean, the parallel to this is that after Dylan Roof shot,
right,
that we suddenly all came to the conclusion that the Confederate flag had to go. That was like a similar.
Yeah, that one was very strange to me. It's a similar thing of it's. I mean, it's almost like there's no we have the people who are killed cannot be brought back. What can we possibly do? There seems to be nothing. There's no concrete action we can take. So then we move to the symbolic action of flags being removed or statues being removed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, why don't you do the lead-in that you were going to do, because this is related to the piece, but...
Yeah, well, why don't you just... the piece is very interesting, and I recommend everyone check it out, but, I mean, what are your thoughts on this push to the fact that monuments are now the locus of the debate instead of something that's actually a material condition kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, so back actually when stuff with the Confederate flag was happening with Dylan Ruth, someone asked, and I am Southern by birth and by where I've grown up, but I have a deep hatred of lost causism.
So where did you grow up?
I was born in New Orleans, and I grew up, or I lived there till I was 7, and then I spent most of the rest of my childhood in Tennessee.
Okay.
And I think I have only spent around 9 months of my life above the Mason-Dixon line. So, but anyway, someone was like, after the flags, what's to stop people from taking down monuments? And my thought was, well, the monuments are different because looking at Confederate monuments makes me sad. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of tragic monument to a horrible episode in America's past. And then the monuments themselves often have quite ugly histories. So to me, it's kind of, or was, sort of like, this is a monument to America's sins. It's like it's more complicated than a Confederate flag, because mm-hmm. the Confederate flag is always kind of triumphalist. And then watching the reaction here, when you see the actual kind of last gasp of the KKK show up because they're angry that you're taking a statue down, or these Unite the Right types, you begin to realize, or I decided that the statues are not quite as sort of rich or reflective or trying to think, recriminatory as I sort of imagine them to be. Mm-hmm. And so both of the statues in question in Charlottesville are statues that went up in the 1920s. Both of them were accompanied in the kind of timeline around them. In both cases, there was quite a bit of Klan activity, though the Klan wasn't, say, like part of the unveiling of either statue. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when you look at, say, the contemporary papers at the time, the Klan was quite well regarded. There was, I think, shortly after the Lee statue was unveiled, there was a news article in the Daily Progress, which is Charlottesville's newspaper, still is, about the Klan bombing a black church, and basically ends with something like the people in the area commend this action and hope that it will keep bad behavior in line. Mm-hmm. And I posted this on Twitter, and somebody said, "Oh, is that a typo for condemn?" And I was like, "No." Uh-huh. That's just so. I think I had this idea initially that these things had kind of changed in meaning, and now I no longer think that they have, though I don't think it's impossible for them to. The other side of this, like you say, is addressing material harms with these symbolic corrections. In terms of Charlottesville I would say Charlottesville is one of the most visibly segregated places I have lived. So there's say that. The city has passed an equity package, which has generated less debate and which is putting money into the African American Heritage Center and some public parks in predominantly black neighborhoods and so on. So there is, that predates that, but there is some attempt right now to kind of reckon with Charlottesville's own legacy here. And more broadly, though, I don't know, because now I do kind of want them gone, all the statues, but at the same time, say the legacy of Jim Crow era policies isn't going to go away just because the Jim Crow era statues are gone. And that's obviously a fairly simple point, but the question is where the energy and attention goes once this has kind of been cathartically released. Is it like, well, now that we've kind of made this decision about what we want to look like and how we want to think about our past, is that accompanied by some kind of community effort to address what that's done to the present? And to some extent, one problem with this conversation is that now, people are just kind of opining about statues, but say, the way that the statues will go down, if they do go down in Charlottesville, is not the way that it happened in Baltimore, isn't the way that it happened in Durham. And so similarly, community redress is going to happen in those communities. It's not like I could come up with a policy on Twitter and tweet it out and it would be the right solution, in each community. There are probably some things that are kind of generally shared, but so the other difficult part of this is that this really has to be kind of a localized and concrete conversation, which we are not great at having right now. It seems to me we want to talk about everything in the most abstract and generalized way, to the point where we're almost at the point of just arguing, should we put up statues of people at all, which is a bit strange.
There was a piece that ran today in Vice. Did you see that one?
I saw it, but I didn't read it.
It was an interesting piece. It first went up with the headline. How did they put it? I'll mangle the headline, but they were forced to change the headline when they initially was calling for blowing up monuments, or blowing, I guess it was blow up Mount Rushmore was maybe the original headline. So they changed that, and the piece was smarter than the headline. But the argument of the piece is basically like, a statue of someone is an instance of state power, embodying in a person the state's values, and there's no perfect person, and so maybe there should be no statues. It's an interesting argument, but we're kind of stuck with all these statues that we have already. And
now
I don't think the human urge to make statues. What I was thinking about it is one of the oldest recorded urges we know about because of all the statues and engravings from antiquity. there just is this kind of deep desire to make permanent human likeness and
Yeah.
put it in a place where other people can look at it. I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, and I mean, one in the Charlottesville kind of community forums about whether or not to take away the statue. And there's actually, for people who are kind of independently interested in this, there's a great giant PDF of information about this that they put out. It is linked to in my article. So I think it's the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race and Public Space or something like that. But there's definitely a sizable African American population in Charlottesville that doesn't want the monuments to go because they feel like it's whitewashing history.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, actually, it's very important that this be here so that it can be like, well, you did this. You not only fought on this side in this war, but you erected these monuments with this ugly history to kind of keep, I think that it was even a segregated park. So it's just kind of, but it would be interesting if that there just shouldn't be representative art became like a mainstream political opinion.
Yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So watching the video as it came, as it was happening of the crowd or the mob, I guess you could call it, bringing down the statue in Durham, I had mixed reactions. I mean, there is kind of like a thrill of seeing people toppling a statue that, makes it seem like the dictatorship is falling, although we don't live in a dictatorship. But those are the images, the classic images from the 20th century of the end of that kind of rule.
Then it just crumples.
Yeah, it was shockingly. There was actually, I think this was just on Twitter. Someone was saying that these monuments were kind of almost mass produced in a cheap way. It wasn't like each one was individually sculpted. They were often cast one time and then multiple copies were made. So it was kind of like this wasn't solid gold. That's why it kind of crumpled so easily once it was toppled. But one thing I'd like to ask you about is, do you see a difference between the monument of the type that was brought down in Durham, where it was an anonymous soldier, versus a military leader like Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because there's also, say in New Orleans, there's a third type of monument, this one's gone now, which was the Battle of Liberty Place monument, which was basically, was explicitly dedicated, I think, to white supremacy. So there's like explicitly racist monuments, and then generals, and then anonymous. And
correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't New Orleans largely in Union hands during the Civil War?
This I don't know.
Someone in the history buffs in the comments, please correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. I thought New Orleans was captured as a strategic port very early on, and that's one of the the Confederacy was not allowed to bring freight up through the Mississippi because of that.
Yeah, the specific thing that the monument commemorates was during Reconstruction, so it's post Civil War. But I think that in the case of the monument in Durham, the stuff that makes it uncomfortable to me is not so much what it stands for, but where it is, because it was in front of, I guess, I've seen it referred to as the Durham Old Courthouse, but I don't know if that is a building currently in use as a courthouse, but presumably would have been when the monument was put up. And so I think, in a general sense, monuments just commemorating the anonymous dead do seem less troublesome than, like, here's Lee, great man, or Jackson, or Jefferson Davis. But in that case, I think having a monument like that right by a courthouse is a little bit. It seems like a threat almost. So, but the other monument, and this one I don't know. I'm not like versed in its history. That's controversial in Durham is Silent Sam, which is I think this is in Durham, is a monument to all of the graduates of a college who died in the Confederate Army, and that one's been very hotly debated. And that one I have more mixed feelings about because those people really were there and they did die. And it's the masses of people who died is a tragic thing,
right?
And again, I just feel like, but again, it just seems like that's a monument that makes you sad. But that's how I feel about Lee too. So, and it's clear that it doesn't really have that meaning for many people. That they do view it as more triumphalist. So I don't know if it's also true of Silent Sam or monuments that are just kind of generally to the dead. And a sort of slippery slope argument I've seen that is related to this is what about Confederate graves? But it's actually quite hard for me to imagine anyone going after a grave site. I mean, that hits a lot of taboos, just, and that at least is one thing I feel confident that no one can find triumphalist in any sense, looking at a grave.
Right. Well, it depends on, the kind of 19th century statuary monuments that are in some graveyards are sometimes, soaring monolith kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you think that this? I mean, I've seen some commentary online that Trump is shrewd to make this to try to push the debate towards Confederate monuments instead of towards his finding an equivalence between neo-Nazis and people fighting neo-Nazis, and that he's kind of baiting a trap that people on the left are falling into to make it over, the great General Lee instead of the abhorrent neo-Nazis. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess actually this is just has the conversation really become about Lee instead of the equivocation between unite the right and the counter-protesters?
Well, I would predict that on the president's favorite TV show, Fox and Friends, they're going to spend more time talking about a wacky person who wants to bring down the Washington Monument because Washington owned slaves, instead of the fact that the president's supporters include white supremacists and neo-Nazis.
Yeah, but wouldn't they do that anyway?
Well, it is. I
mean, wouldn't they? I mean, they're definitely not going to have a conversation where it's like, what about Trump's Nazi problem on Fox and Friends? Like,
it creates.
If they have to go onto Tumblr and find the one person who's like, we got to blow up the Lincoln Memorial, they're gonna, they're gonna find that person.
Yeah, that's true. And Tucker Carlson's TV show, although I don't have cable, but I see people making fun of it online a lot, in particular, seems to pluck out the, find a wacky college student and bring him or her on to.
Yeah, I did. I do not watch Tucker Carlson's show either, but I did see a screen capture of like him with some kind of infographic about slavery. It was like, slavery is like evil, but it was legal. Plato owned slaves.
And
so
Muhammad,
the Native Americans.
Yeah, Muhammad owned slaves. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I guess so, and I feel like I've seen a huge amount of commentary from sort of mainstream and left sources that are like, equating these two things is insane. And then there are people who, I mean, is it Mark Lilla?
Mm-hmm.
Mark, yeah, who's got this book coming out about identity politics, and so then there are people like him being like, oh, well, actually, in identity politics, white people is what you get from Black Lives Matter or what have you, because he's blogging his book. But
right. Well, it does. Defending statues of Confederate generals is kind of white Southern identity politics.
yeah. But all I was gonna say is, so I feel like I haven't really seen that stop and like switch to only monuments all the time. So I guess to a certain extent I debate the question, but I also think, people, I think a lot of people do believe that there were these Antifa wandering around Charlottesville just beating up kind of harmless people. I don't think, I honestly don't know what to do about, because I think there are too many people who hear that equivocation and think like, oh, that's dead on.
Mm-hmm.
And they they have a kind of horseshoe theory-esque thing where it's like, yeah, the neo-Nazis are bad, but things wouldn't have gotten bad there if Antifa hadn't been there or whatever. And I really hope I'm saying Antifa correctly.
I've heard Antifa and Antifa. It's a stupid word. You would think people who are fighting fascists would come up with a better term for themselves than
Yeah,
Antifa.
I also, when I was at the KKK counter protest and they were there, and someone said, I really wish they would get a different banner because their banner looks really fascist. It's like very black and angular, so I saw where they were coming from. But yeah, I mean, I think, if you go to the Federalist, and you see a lot of things that are like, yeah, absolutely, super extremist leftist violence is a huge problem, and Trump's just addressing that head on. And to some extent, the monument conversation is almost easier to have than that conversation, because you can kind of take it case by case and be like, well, like this statue has an ugly, I almost feel more able to like convince someone of that than I do that that there weren't just people like just punching people out at random. So I guess I just think, I honestly do not know what can be said about Trump that would convince someone who's still with him right now that there's a problem here. And
well, there are people who are jumping ship because of what's happened over the past 5 days.
Yeah,
so there was this piece in the Times put up today by a guy who was
the American Affairs guy.
Yeah, so one of the few conservative intellectuals who was on the Trump train, and he has jumped off the Trump train. So there are, so there are people who this event is causing them to re-examine their allegiance.
I'm kind of thinking of like the people I know on Facebook who voted for Trump, and who kind of post a lot about how scared they are of leftist violence and stuff.
Okay.
And I mean, for instance, I found that, back in the inauguration when some nameless hero clocked Richard Spencer in the face. Like a lot of people, I found that kind of cathartic and funny. Maybe that doesn't reflect well on me, but I did. And people I knew were horrified because they don't know any of the context. They just see some guy just get punched in the face, and so I think that incident, almost more than anything, has kind of cemented in their minds that this is like a really dangerous threat, and that these people just go around punching anyone they disagree with.
Uh-huh.
And anyway, so I don't know, like with those people, I think that the monument conversation is almost easier to win than the violence conversation, because you can't really, I don't know how to convince somebody of the non-existence of a violent threat.
Mm-hmm.
Even being there, it's like, well, obviously there was violence that I didn't see because I've seen video of it. So I can't be like, I was there and we were all singing Kumbaya.
Right.
And so on. But what do you think about it?
I had a Blogging Heads conversation debate with the writer Hannah Gaze about about punching Nazis and the no platforming stuff. Mm-hmm. That left many Blogging Heads commenters unsatisfied, to say the least. But I also, seeing Richard Spencer, who was a detestable person, getting clocked, sent, a thrill up my leg, as someone once said. And, seeing when you watch the Captain America movie, when he punches the Nazi, you feel good. Mm-hmm. But we live in a country that is not ruled by fascists, and we have laws. So randomly punching people is bad. And I think the Antifa are ultimately hurting their own cause by making it seem like there is a legitimate leftist threat, when a threat of violence, when there truly isn't. And just the people who show up at a protest ready to brawl are just mm-hmm. very misguided and probably bad people. Like if you go to a protest wearing a helmet, like I tweeted this a couple months ago, if you go to a protest wearing a helmet, like, you are a jackass, mm-hmm. because you are working to degrade the kind of civil society that we want to have in America. So I'm not in favor of Antifa, but obviously Trump's drawing a moral equivalence and saying, there were good people on both sides. Opposing white supremacy is morally superior to being a white supremacist, and the fact that the leader of our country wants to deny that is troubling, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also say I think I agree with you generally that people who show up at a protest ready to brawl it's not a good thing. I think there were aspects of, like, kind of knowing there were people in the crowd who could really have a fight that was a bit comforting. Like, if I got in a sticky situation, someone would probably show up to, like, punch someone out for me. Mm-hmm. That didn't happen, but I mean, but this is like a very not quite one of a kind situation. But it's not often that you're dealing with a bunch of heavily armed, literal neo-Nazis, such that you kind of like the feeling that there's some kind of strong arming.
Right. I mean, how did
to you?
When you were at the protest, what was your sense of the police presence? Because we discussed this a little bit, but you shouldn't be relying on a fellow citizen to punch out an attacker on your behalf. You should be relying on the police to prevent that from happening, or if it does happen, to arrest the perpetrator.
Right. No, I mean that's absolutely true. The police presence was basically very withdrawn until they were suddenly extremely present, if that. So, when I showed up and was wandering around, there wasn't a very strong police presence. And then they declared that it was an unlawful assembly, and then suddenly there were, riot police out there, and things got a lot more intense. And actually, interestingly, the conduct of the police is the one thing that everyone can agree was bad.
Mm-hmm.
The neo-Nazis agree it's bad. The ACLU thinks it was bad. Counter-protesters thought it was bad. But they sort of, it was partly one legal dispute leading up to this was that the city wanted to move the protest to a different park. And the ACLU got involved, and they restored the permit to be held in the park where the Statue of Lee is.
Mm-hmm.
And the ACLU's argument was sort of, well, your concerns that there are too many people for this space and that things get ugly is kind of like a bad faith cover for the fact that you just don't want, you ideologically object to having this in your city.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was true, except that the space concern was actually also real. It was kind of doing double duty.
Mm-hmm.
And the statue, the park that the Lee statue is in is like a block. And so it was like all these people crammed into that park, all the protesters kind of crammed into the street next to the park.
Mm-hmm.
There almost wasn't room for the police until they disbanded it. And it was just a mess.
A joke tweet that I saw in the aftermath of this was, for the equestrian statues of Confederate generals, remove the generals, leave the horses. Which is funny, but it does kind of get at something. I wonder if there's a not a compromise exactly, but if you left the pedestal, if you removed
Mm-hmm.
the human figure and left the pedestal, I wonder if that could end up satisfying people, because then you're not erasing history, but you are removing from sanctification the figure who supported something awful, the existence
Mm-hmm.
of slavery. Does this strike you as a silly idea, or this just came to me? So
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I'm sort of imagining like I think they're sort of two. I guess I don't think it would be a workable compromise in actual. The people who don't want the statues gone are still going to be mad about it, and the people who do want them gone presumably want something else there, since the statue kind of pulls the park together, as
Mm-hmm.
it were. But I also am kind of picturing here's the thing. No one actually reads the plaques on monuments, right? Or almost nobody.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about walking into a park with an empty pedestal, and then I guess a plaque that would just say once there was a statue of Robert E. Lee here.
Mm-hmm.
But it would really just look like an empty pedestal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most people, maybe they'd be curious enough to look. I'm thinking this through, and
yeah, maybe you could have use as a space for a revolving community sculpture or something like that. Kind of like an art exhibit. I don't know. Just putting that idea out there. I had one more thing I wanted to ask you, but it's slipping my mind. Is there anything else you want to say about this very vexed topic?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I would want to say about it is just, following this conversation on Twitter, is that I really wish that people would be willing to talk about this as like a series of specific issues, and less a kind of national conversation about statues.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for instance, like people will say, well, isn't there a more democratic way to do this? But in terms of Charlottesville, it was, there were meetings, people could come to them, there was a vote. It's like, random blogger who lives somewhere doesn't get a vote because she doesn't live here. And so that's one thing. I think that talking about this as a kind of like entirely general issue just isn't very smart.
Mm-hmm.
And also, just in terms of, say, like even the conflict in Charlottesville, this kind of both sidesism is basically a way of having to avoid dealing with any details about what happened, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I can just say, oh, well, there was a lot of extremism in Charlottesville and extremism is bad. But I don't have to kind of dig into any accounts of what happened because I've just kind of... So basically, I guess a call for detail and like willingness to look into things on a case-by-case basis instead of being like, we need a national consensus on what to do with every statue in America right now.
Yeah.
And because it's just not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And even, I mean, if I were like king of Charlottesville, I guess, and I would actually prefer not to take them down, but to do something that kind of contextualizes them where they are. So, well, this is not a Charlottesville statue, but there's a statue of Tawney, the Dred Scott judge, by the State House in Annapolis, Maryland. And so, and this is probably coming down too, but another thing would be to have a statue of Dred Scott next to him. That kind of thing. And that is what I would prefer, because I think there's a lot of this that we should be thinking about. It should be making us feel sad, and like reflect on this legacy in America. And I would, in some cases, would prefer that to taking these things down. In the case of, say, the Lee statue, I don't quite know what you do. There's not like do you make statues of dead people that you stack around his horse or what? That would be a very pleasant park. But, so in some cases, there's kind of an obvious thing that you could do. In some cases, not. But again, so the conversation also doesn't have to be take them down or leave them up. It can be take them down, leave them up, but commission more art, leave them up, but put up more plaques. Also with some of the Charlottesville stuff, there was what can we build monuments to in this town that we haven't? That was another question. Like, what are the things that we can do? And so one thing is there's a plaque where the slave auction block was. That's fallen into disrepair, so they'll be updating that and stuff like that. So basically, if I could say one thing, it would be willing to have a conversation that's actually more limited, and deals with specifics more, and isn't just like, I hate the way that to like allow as many people to opine about something as quickly as possible, it has to be put in like the most useless way. So then it just sort of becomes, would you tear down everything that reminds people of the Confederacy right now? Or would you vote to have anyone who did that electrocuted on the spot? Like that suddenly becomes kind of or it's like, people start calling you Soviet and so on for erasing history. So anyway, yeah, that's my plea for detail.
As we close, I want to put in a plug for a monument in the town I live, Rochester, New York. I believe it's the Frederick Douglass statue and monument, and I believe it's the first public statue of an African American in U.S. history. It was put up in the late 19th century. Douglass lived the last part of his life in Rochester and is buried in
Mm-hmm.
Rochester. And it's in a lovely park called Highland Park. If any Blogging Heads fans ever want to make a pilgrimage, I'd be happy to guide you to the Frederick Douglass statue. So maybe the answer is more statues, especially of people who didn't receive them originally because of prejudice and injustice, rather than fewer statues.
Yeah. And in some places, I mean, the answer is that yeah, case by case. But I think I'm more pro making art of people who've been unjustly neglected than I have strong feelings about leaving up statues. And I think, yeah, put a statue of Fred Douglass in every town. That would be.
um, uh, so thanks so
He's
much.
being recognized more and more.
Yeah. I hear about that all the time.
Uh,
Um, yeah, we live in an absurd time.
yeah.
Uh, thanks for coming on. Where can people find more of your work if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I have a website where I gather my writing, so that's bdmcclay.com. Um, and you can also find me on Twitter at the same. It's just BD McClay. Um, and I don't actually tweet a lot about topical things, so if you come expecting like a lot of takes, you're gonna be real bored. um, I'm only tweeting about this because I live here, so it's like my 15 minutes of fame. But
I
yeah,
I endorse
and
following you on Twitter, even if you're not spouting off hot takes. Um, yeah, so thanks so much, BD McClay, for coming on. Thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
yeah, thank you.